Welcome back to my course, History of Socialism. Today, our next lecture about the emergence of communism. So let me establish this, a bridge sort of between what we did last time and what we are going to do today. Remember, last time we talked about so-called revisionism. It's a trend within the socialist creed that tried to mute and revise revolutionary Marxism. Okay, so to some extent, taking out the teeth of revolution from Marxism. And the names we brought up to our attention was, first of all, Bernstein, Annie Besant, British Fabians, who tried to mute the slogan of revolution, slogan of barricades, radicalism, militancy, and putting more emphasis on stealth socialism, gradual socialism, working within the system. And in fact, Bernstein, as we remember, famously said that the destination is nothing, the movement is everything, asking socialists and the grassroots, who provided the base for socialist working class people, to be focused on the daily needs of the workers. Don't think about utopias. Think about your immediate needs. Concentrate on this. Not everybody agreed with this. There was an emergent minority of people within socialism who absolutely rejected this notion of revisionism, who came to criticize Bernstein, Fabians, who started to argue that Marx, what he had created, was the ideology of revolution. So we don't need to live within the existing society. We don't need to put up with the existing society. We need to smash capitalism. We need to smash the existing system, especially when the moment was right. And these people, this element, radical element, came to conclusion that the moment was right in the beginning of the 20th century. The moment was right for the Marxian revolution. So we're talking today about the people who tried to go back to the revolutionary creed of Karl Marx, who tried to revive the radical militant notions. Okay, and our conversation today will be focused on the emergence of the second most influential trend within socialism. I'm talking here about the 20th century. The second trend became known as communism. The topics or major items or points we are going to discuss today is two persons who will be interesting for us, who were spearheads of this revival of militant socialism. First, Russian socialist Vladimir Lenin, and the cosmopolitan Russian, Polish / German / Jewish socialist Rosa Luxemburg. Then we will be talking about socialist utopian literature that affected the minds of radicals who wanted to transform society and how they wanted to transform society. We will be talking about how Bolshevism emerged. Bolshevism is something that Vladimir Lenin shaped, formed, which eventually gave rise to the communist movement. Another important thing, we're going to talk about the role of World War I in spearheading communism. We will briefly talk about the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And we will end by mentioning that Bolsheviks, who jump-started the communist movement, eventually set up the global alliance of militant socialists called the Communist International. It's 1990. All right, let's start with the two persons who tried to question what Bernstein and other revisionists, and in fact revisionists were the majority of the socialist movement. Okay, so we are going to talk about Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, two persons who challenged what Edward Bernstein had to say. First, let me bring to your attention this person on your right, Vladimir Lenin, Russian Bolshevik, Russian socialist. Lenin belonged to a cosmopolitan and multi-ethnic family. I'm using the present-day jargon. He was one of several children born in a noble family of a school inspector. His father was a mixed origin, Russian Kalmyk, or to make it clear, Russian Mongolian origin. Okay, so hence this, if you look at his picture, you will see this Mongolian face. At the same time, on his mother's side, he had German and Jewish lineage. So he was like literal example of this multi-ethnic offspring, or Eurasian person, okay, because Russia is a Eurasian country, and he embodied this, okay. He was upset that his elder brother was executed by the Russian Tsar, Russian Emperor, for being part of a plot to assassinate the Tsar. Okay, so from early on, when he was in his 17th year, he nourished this grudge against the regime because his brother was involved in socialist activities, but his brother was hooked on so-called peasant socialism. He had this utopian notion. By the way, this utopian notion later became very popular in the 20th century in the third world countries. Peasant socialism, that peasants who were people who had this tribal, primal socialism. They lived in communes and they had to teach something the modern society. So we need to follow this peasant commune, peasant socialism. And Lenin at some point realized that was not the way to go, and that's how Lenin embraced Marxism. Okay, he said we shouldn't be hooked on these peasant utopias. Peasants were backward elements, deplorable. So it's something that throwbacks from old society. We should look into the future. Factories, working class people, and natural history laws, as Marx said, would push society toward this future where we would have the industrial order with factories, working class people, and eventually working class people come and smash capitalism at some point when they become the majority. So we talked about this. And supposedly he told his mother, okay, that's like a legend, okay, there is no confirmation that he actually said these words. But later Soviet Marxists, they repeated this phrase. Supposedly he said to his mother, who of course was sad when the brother was hanged, his elder brother, and Lenin supposedly said to his mother, "This is not our way. We shall go another way." You know, so it means we are not going to be hooked on this primal peasant socialism. We will go the progressive Marxian way. Anyway, Lenin was a participant of one of the first groups of Marxists in Russia, and for taking part in one of these groups, he was exiled to Siberia by the Tsarist regime, and he spent 3 years in Siberia from 1897 to 1900. It was not exactly uncomfortable life. He was free to go anywhere. In Siberia, of course, he was not allowed to leave the place, but he went hunting. He had plenty of books. It was just the remote area, northeasternmost part of Siberia. where regime relegated him to kind of keep him away from the cities. But when he was in his exile, he found out about Bernstein. He found out about revisionism. And he was very sad about this, and he decided to join the movement against revisionism, against Bernstein. He was impatiently waiting when his exile terms would be over. And when it was over in 1900, so he goes to Europe. He moves to Europe, where he stays, by the way, until 1917. So he becomes a professional revolutionary. That was his favorite expression. He said that we need to revive revolutionary Marxism. He was convinced that proletariat, working class people. So basically, the debate was about how to approach these noble savages. Again, I put it in quotation marks because Lenin didn't use this expression. It's my expression. Because for Marxism, the working class people, industrial workers, or proletariat as they call them, the proletariat was something sacred. It was the class that was to redeem the humankind from oppression. So the problem was how to approach these people who were salt of the earth, redeemers. Okay, how do we approach them? Bernstein said we just should improve their living conditions. That's it. So don't talk about utopias. And Lenin said, no, you betray the cause of the working class. You have to smash capitalism. But how? Lenin writes a book called What is to be Done? What is to be done, 1900, right? When he left his exile. In this book, he comes up with this idea of revolutionary party. He said, we don't need to dilute our political party with this revisionism. It doesn't mean anything. It's betrayal of the working class people. What we need vanguard, disciplined party. So we need a group of people who could be intellectuals, preferably, or it could be workers who do not work at their factories, who devote all their time to professional revolutionary activities, okay? And they would instill Marxism in the masses of working class people. So they would be like enlightened masters who would bring the knowledge to the working class people, okay? Knowledge of the Marxian science, okay? And he was convinced that Marxian science, he called it science, or Marxian history laws, that was the knowledge. The knowledge, he said, it was the perfect science. At one point, Lenin even said that Marxism, I quote, is omnipotent because it is true. So see, it's like this hegemonic way to impose Marxist knowledge, and the people who would bring this knowledge into the working class people would be these enlightened masters, professional revolutionaries. They would make a vanguard, okay, disciplined party. We shouldn't accept everybody in our socialist party. It should be highly disciplined, highly committed, underground. And again, he basically was using the Russian experience. All his experience of political work and struggle was based on what? On his experience of life in Russia, which was an authoritarian country, which didn't have elections, did not have political parties, didn't have any unions. So socialists had to work underground. So his experience was based on what he was exposed to in Russia. And it was very much different from how socialists operated in Western Europe, where in the 1890s, for example, a socialist party was legalized in Germany. In England, socialism was legal. Okay, in France it was legal. In Switzerland and Sweden, okay, there were no existential threats. Okay, but he came up with this concept, and he said, not necessarily Russian experience is relevant here. We need to aspire for this Marxist purity. He said Bernstein betrayed the cause of socialism, even in Western Europe. So what he said was the betrayal of revolution, betrayal of dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay, he didn't talk about this. We do need the dictatorship. Workers need to take power, guided by the party, Socialist Party. Okay. Not everybody agreed with him. There was a woman equally radical, equally militant. Her name is Rosa Luxemburg, who agreed with him, with Lenin, that yes, Bernstein betrayed the cause of revolutionary Marxism, and she actually joined him and people who agreed with her. But at the same time, she disagreed with this elitist concept proposed by Lenin of the vanguard, these enlightened masters who would navigate the working class people, would lead them. Okay. Briefly about Rosa Luxemburg. Like Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg was a multi-ethnic person who grew up. She grew up in a Jewish family in Poland. The Poland at that time, until 1917, was part of the Russian Empire. So she knew the Russian language, she knew Polish language, and she belonged to the Jewish tradition. At the same time, she was sent by her wealthy father, who was a timber trader. She was sent to Germany for schooling, to study, and she actually became grounded in German culture. So we cannot say that she belonged only to Polish Jewish traditions. She also was exposed to the Russian tradition because she knew the Russian language, and she was schooled in Germany. In fact, later she moves to Germany. She marries a German man to get her documents, German documents, and she becomes one of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party. Remember, German Social Democratic Party was the backbone of the Western socialist movement. Okay, so Rosa Luxemburg becomes the leader of the militant faction within the German Social Democratic Party. Okay, and she also came to criticize Bernstein, but the way she criticized Bernstein was not this elitist Lenin's way. What she argued, again, the major issue was what to do and how to approach these working class people, the salt of the earth. And she said, what Lenin said was too elitist. Lenin, she said, underestimate the wisdom of the workers. Okay, real Marxist Rosa Luxemburg argued that should trust the working class people, should trust their minds, should embrace them. Basically, what she said, that you don't need this enlightened group of the vanguard. You should trust the instincts of the working class people. And she came to defend what we may define as the spontaneous working class revolution. So from down below, at the most appropriate moment, when the time is ripe, the proletariat would revolt against capitalism, okay, from down below, self-organized. So she believed in the spontaneity and organic activism of the working class people. So this sort of romantic faith in the wisdom of the workers, okay, because Lenin, who also said that, yes, working class people is the salt of the earth, but they work, for goodness sake, 12 or 14 hours, even 10 hours, they're tired, they have no time to read books and to get involved in intellectual activities. You do need this group of intellectual masters, who could be workers, by the way, workers who decided to become professional revolutionaries to enlighten their brothers and sisters in the wisdom of Marxism. But Luxemburg said, disagreed with this. She said, no. It's by sheer fact of the working in the factory, by rubbing shoulders with each other, working with machines, handling these heavy metals machines. So working class people, they acquire this wisdom. Okay. So that's what you need to trust. They would feel when the time is ripe to revolt against the existing system. So there was this small debate. And by the way, if you talk with current socialists, many of them radical socialists, they worship Rosa Luxemburg. If you go on Google, you will see a bunch of these romantic memes glorifying Rosa Luxemburg. And plus, reason they romanticize her because she died the death of a martyr. Okay, she actually was murdered in 1919 by the right-wing social democrats. Okay, who were fighting against this spontaneous working class revolution she endorsed. Okay, so there was a conflict between these two groups, and the right social democrats, workers, by the way, okay, were asking German military to come to suppress the German Revolution that tried to seize economy, tried to nationalize economy, tried to take power. It's in 1919. She was executed, so she became a martyr, and now she is romanticized. But the major reason why in our current times Rosa Luxemburg is romanticized is because she came up with this concept of spontaneous organic activities of working class people from down below. Okay, in her time, in her lifetime, she wasn't popular, by the way. Yes, Lenin and communists and social democrats and many people on the left, they gave tribute to her for dying for the cause of socialism. But at the same time, she was sidelined before the 1960s. She was sidelined. Why? Because she did not believe in this authoritarian hierarchical system that was on the minds of the people at that time. Again, she did not fit the paradigm of that time when people believe in statism, nourish state worship, mobilization, martial methods. Everybody, including socialists, okay? Socialists believed in centralized planning, that things should be done from up to bottom, okay? The command and control from up above. So within the revolutionary movement, within economy, within political life, it should be centralized. That was the modernity. Okay, so Rosa Luxemburg did not fit in. Okay, so that is why later her writings were revived. And in fact, jumping ahead here, in 1917, when Lenin and his comrades took over power in Russia, she came to criticize them for the dictatorship, okay, for suppressing other political parties. So that's what I would like to mention in this respect, that we have these militants who believed in working class revolution but had disagreements about how we should do it. Okay, and of course Rosa Luxemburg failed in 1919. There was a revolution attempt in Germany to overthrow capitalism spontaneously, the street fighting, and workers lost at that time. Lenin wanted to teach Western socialists how to be true socialists. Okay, basically, he was a new kid on the block when he comes to Europe in 1900, and he is disgusted with Bernstein, even Karl Kautsky, with his idea of parliamentary parliament as the way to power, wasn't radical enough for him. So I'm going to teach these pampered, these spoiled Western socialists how to be a real socialist. That was basically the message. Russian socialists had a Congress, Second Congress in London, where they jump-started the Russian Socialist Democratic Party. That's how many socialist parties were called at that time, social democratic parties. In London, in the Second Congress, Russian Social Democratic Party was established. Why the Second Congress? Because there was an attempt within Russia in 1898 in the Russian Jewish area in the westernmost part of Russia to hold a small Congress, to jumpstart the Russian Socialist Democratic Party. But the whole group was arrested and this attempt failed. So socialists from Russia decided to do it outside of Russia. They meet in London and they set up their own party. At the Second Congress already, there emerged a split between two groups of Russian socialists. Okay, one group became known as the Bolsheviks, the people who followed Lenin, and another group which argued against Lenin and his comrades became known as Mensheviks. Bolsheviks means the people, literally in translation from Russian, people of the majority. Mensheviks means the people of minority. Okay, why such labels? It's because during this Congress, Lenin was able to receive the majority of votes. So he outvoted these Mensheviks who found themselves in minority. Okay, and both groups criticized each other. Lenin said, we need the disciplined party, so we shouldn't accept all workers. We shouldn't open it to all workers. It should be a disciplined group of professional revolutionaries. Mensheviks said, no, we need to accept everybody. It should be open party. And soon they started to debate about the timing of the revolution. Timing. Lenin argued that we actually are almost ready to revolt against the regime, both in Russia and in the West, against existing system. Menshevik said, no, you cannot say this. Why? Because Russia was still a backward country. It's a peasant country. Remember, on the evolutionary scale of Marxism, it was not industrial enough. It didn't have enough proletarians. It was the peasant country. You couldn't make a socialist revolution a peasant country. It wasn't ripe enough. But Lenin said, no, you're wrong, Mensheviks. You shouldn't sit and wait. Look, in the US, UK, Germany, capitalism basically won. We do have periphery areas like Africa, China, Russia, but globally speaking, capitalism won. You cannot wait that in each remote corner of the world, like Papua New Guinea or some kind of Pacific Islands or in Siberia, capitalism to win. Globally speaking, it had won already. That was his argument. So we need to be ready for the revolution. So the basically militant position. Okay. Lenin argued that peasants exist in Russia. In fact, we have a lot of them. But so what? These are deplorable splinters of pre-modern backward society. Okay? So what we are going to do, we are going to use them, peasants, as allies. Okay? So it means Russian backwardness was not a liability, it was an asset. How come? And he made an argument. He said, look, Russia is the country that was partially industrialized, has at least 2-3 cities with a developed industry, with proletariat, about 2 million people. And it was already plagued by these contradictions of capitalism. So we have this messiah class, working class people in Russia who would be joining the Western brothers and sisters to smash capitalism. But on top of this, we have an old contradiction that we inherited from the previous stage of evolution, feudal society. What was this contradiction? The contradiction between landlords and peasants, because the land still belonged to landlords and the peasants craved to seize these lands. So on top of the capitalist contradiction, bourgeoisie against proletariat, we have still the old contradiction we inherited from the previous stage of evolution, the fight between landlords and peasants. Third, we have the third contradiction. Russia was a multi-ethnic country which had 16 major nationalities which craved for their own independence, especially in the western part of Russian Empire. Poles, Ukrainians, Baltic areas, they wanted to get nationhood, which worked for us too, because these forces of nationalism might blow up the Russian Empire. Look, guys, he said, if you watch carefully what was going on in Russia, in fact, Russian backwardness could be a good spark or a good match, okay, that could ignite the fire of the worldwide revolutionary Holocaust. That's what he argued. Russia was the weakest link, he said, that could be used to jumpstart the worldwide socialist revolution. Okay, that was his argument. And now we come to the very important point. Okay, very important point. Look at this slide. World War I. Although Lenin talked what he said, what he had to say about the development of capitalism and Russia being the weakest link, he wasn't sure yet in his lifetime the revolution might happen. He said soon, yes, but when soon, I don't know. And here the World War I comes. And World War I was the blessing for the militant socialists. Okay, blessing. I always, when I teach this course in modern history, in this particular course on my Russian Soviet history courses, I always emphasize the role of the World War I, which pretty much defined the course of development of world history for the entire 20th century. It's inaugurated the 20th century. Okay, the horrendous destruction the humankind experienced during the World War I, the sheer number of victims. Millions of people died. Okay, but the most was profound. You know, it's culturally, psychologically, economically. The war was something that undermined the development of humankind, because everybody was involved, even those countries which did not directly fight each other, like Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia. They also had to be involved. Okay, but the most important thing, World War I created this quote-unquote ethics. What kind of ethics? It's a mindset. What should be done? How government should be ruled? How we should organize our economic life? How we should organize our social life? Okay, and the point I'm trying to make here is that mobilization, statism, martial methods became very popular during World War I, and for many people, East and West, including the United States, which, by the way, by chance, historically, had a chance to develop independently from these patterns that were widespread in the rest of the world. So uniquely, you know, by chance, because of the benevolent negligence in US, this individualistic tradition had been developed. But even the United States was not immune to this general trend we find winning during World War I. And this trend is the martial ethics, mobilization ethics, okay? The calls for total nationalization of economic life. For example, in many countries, railroads were mobilized, nationalized, okay? Including the United States, roads were put under the state control. And for many politicians and intellectuals, methods pioneered during the First World War became extended to the post-war political and social life. That's what is important for us, okay? So, for many people, martial methods relevant during World War I became the new normal. The new normal. I want to emphasize this, okay? For example, throughout World War I in Germany, they practiced so-called war socialism. We're going to talk more about war socialism. It means extreme regulation, subjecting the entire economic and social life of the country to the purposes of the war, because war means mobilization. You can't avoid it, any war, okay? During the war, we have first concentration camps. This meme, that's the concentration camp, it's a meme which average low information person links to Nazi Germany. That's like Nazi Germany concentration camps. That's wrong, absolutely wrong perception, because the first concentration camps were pioneered in Britain by British, one of the most progressive countries in the world. The first was in South Africa during Anglo-Boer War, and then widely in England and UK. Okay, concentration camps had been created to lock their people of the German origin, and then concentration camps were created in Russia, in Germany too, in many other countries. Okay, and only after this, concentration camps were put on a regular usage, something that was used on a regular basis where? In the Bolshevik Russia and Communist Russia. And then only after this, it was used on a wide scale in Nazi Germany. Okay, that would be the sequence. Britain, Soviet Russia, and then Germany. We have deportations. Millions of people were deported from borderland areas in Russia, for example, where the combat actions was taking place. Okay. Food was rationed, so money became irrelevant during the war because food was rationed, and this system of rationing became the most perfected in Germany. We have first genocide taking place in Armenia by Turks against Armenians. 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered by Turks in 1915. Okay. Lenin argued that war is very important, not simply something that by chance took place and we're going to take advantage of this. Okay, Lenin never considered World War I as an accidental event. He comes to conclusion that was a history law. Remember, Marxism was infested with this idea of history laws, that on the scale of evolution, things happen because they are meant to happen. Okay, there's socioeconomic formations and the history laws, something like unavoidably comes to our life. So basically, he said World War I is something that happened naturally, okay, because of the capitalist development. And that's when he came up with this concept. It wasn't actually his own concept. He picked up these ideas from European economist named Rudolf Hilferding, who developed the concept of imperialism, he argued, Hilferding, that in its highest stage of evolution, capitalism turns into monopoly capitalism. So we have these syndicates, we have these monopolies. Okay, in his mind, originally capitalism had a bunch of small manufacturers, small business people, and then in the process of evolution, these small manufacturers, small business people, they're sucked into this big monopolies, because as a result of competition, the big fish eats small fish, and it's a zero-sum game. That's how they viewed it. See, they never even, Hilferding and Lenin never considered the fact that yes, some people get broke under capitalism, but at the same time we have new companies, new small companies, new businesses popping up, thousands of them. Some of them succeed, some of them fail, and that's how it goes. You know, some businesses go down, some businesses go up. That's what always is happening right now, and it will be happening as long as we have capitalism. Okay, as long as our economy is not nationalized by socialists. But that's not how socialists viewed and still view the development of society. And this guy Hilferding, this European economist, came up with his concept of imperialism. So he said, eventually small business people, they are sucked in by these big monopolies. If, for example, we had 1,000 of textile manufacturers, eventually it's a one textile manufacturer who comes up and he monopolizes the entire textile industry, and he becomes the monopolist. Okay, monopolist. It's like, for example, right now we have Google that basically monopolized the entire internet industry, and some people believe that they're dangerous people, yeah, because they monopolize the entire internet industry. Okay. At the same time, we forget that at the same time we have hundreds of other companies who now begin to challenge Google. And as long as Google doesn't affect the government, doesn't rule the government, okay, to order the rest of society how to behave and how to bow down to Google, everything is fine, because Google eventually becomes the monster that would shoot itself in its foot, you know, because any big structure, monopoly structure, eventually contains the seeds of self-destruction. Okay, because new businesses come up with something progressive, innovative, and eventually can beat these giants like Google, and we see it already. Okay, when Google, for example, tried to censor people, like freedom of speech, and we have alternative platforms that challenge YouTube. You know, YouTube is part of Google, and which become more and more popular, challenging YouTube and Google. But it's another story. Again, I'm trying to show you that this perception of a zero-sum game is not exactly correct, but that's what socialists believe in. So Lenin picks up this notion of Hilferding that at its last stage of development, capitalism turns in so-called imperialism. It means all small businesses are gone, and we have like a dozen of monopolies that control the entire economy. That's how he viewed development of society. Okay, but he said it's good for us. It's good. The bigger, the better. Why? Because look, naturally, capitalism moves toward this public ownership. They become bigger, so they, within capitalism, they already enlarge themselves. Okay, they become pregnant with socialism. See, that was the notion. Okay, so it's good that they monopolize. Okay, and he said, and now the war comes, because these big monopolies, they begin to compete with each other over what? Over resources. They want to get access to resources, to colonies. Okay, they compete with each other and they instigate wars. So the war was a natural law that capitalism provokes. Okay, see, very logical if you look superficial. In fact, Lenin writes a book called Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And he said that's when the capitalism is ripe for the revolution, because look, almost everything is nationalized, but they cannot do it because they still exist with this capitalist matrix. Okay, what we need to smash the top, the political power, and the Socialist Party comes to power, and we have the ready-made economic system, ready-made for socialism. See, that was his view. So basically, World War I is the signal that we need to transition to socialism. We need, because that's this the sign. You need to read the sign of times. Okay, and the sign is over there. It's a writing on the wall. A time to smash capitalism. See, that's how he viewed World War I. It's a natural law, something that naturally came to life of the entire world, that signals that it's time for the socialist revolution. We need to smash capitalism. And for Russian socialists and for many radical socialists in the West, it looked like indeed the writing on the wall. In 1917, he writes another brochure, a small book called The State and the Revolution. So how to take over power. And in this book, he already outlines the plan, how the socialist economy should be organized, how the political power should be organized. And in this particular book, he said, look, capitalist monopolies, it's a splendid mechanism. So they already prepared something for us that's almost nationalized because they're big. See, they smashed all small producers, small manufacturers. They're ripe to be socialized. Okay. Centralization, control, central planning. These are the major words, the key words for Lenin's concept of socialism. Okay. And the war amplifies these notions. So World War I want to emphasize here, becomes the crucible of the radical faction of socialism. World War I becomes the crucible of this state socialism, becomes the crucible of the major approaches to how we understand socialism. So the reason why socialism in the last century was, the concept of socialism was tied to the idea of big state, centralized planning, nationalization of economy, pretty much owes its origin to World War I, where these notions of centralized planning, where the notions of mobilization were amplified. That's what I'm trying to argue here. Okay. Let me tell you briefly about what happened in Russia, because we need to know at least briefly what happened in Russia, because this communist, it became known as the communist revolution. At first they labeled it Bolshevik takeover, and then Lenin and his comrades enshrined it as the communist revolution. Since 1917, communist revolution in Russia was essential for the entire socialist experience in the 20th century. We need to briefly, at least briefly, to talk about this. Again, in my Russian/Soviet history class, I talk more about it, but now we will briefly outline this, what was going on. So World War I, as you know, those of you who read about World War I, you know it was a devastating war, and especially it was devastating for such backward country as Russia, which was still a peasant country, where 80% of people were peasants who used wooden plows, very primitive agriculture. 15 million peasants were mobilized to fight this war, so they were drafted as soldiers, and they were poorly equipped, undernourished, and plus these peasants were pulled out from their villages and they didn't understand what they were fighting for, because they still didn't have this idea of that they were part of Russia. Major loyalty was to the village. Okay, they had this pre-modern concept. It was only in cities people had this. In Russian cities, they were Russians. In Ukrainian cities, Ukrainians. But all of them pledged allegiance to the emperor, Russian Tsar. Again, to make a long story short, cities lacked food. Peasants chafed under the burden of war demands. Okay, since 15 million males were pulled out from agricultural economy, the primitive peasant agriculture wasn't able to provide food. What? For the army. And soon, civilians in Russian cities and other cities, in Poland, part of the Russian Empire, other cities in Baltic areas, lacked food, not enough food to feed the population. Okay, so the backward Russia could not bear the cost of the war. And on top of this, a Russian Tsar, or the emperor who was in power at the time, was Nicholas II, a very weak man who basically didn't like to be in power. He felt more comfortable by hunting, by having a good time with his family. A good man, actually, excellent man, a good family man. Loved his wife, kids, gentle, very educated man. He had a German wife, became a Russian empress. Okay, he also had some German blood in his veins. Again, I'm telling you this because it's important for our to understand why eventually this regime was toppled down during the war. Okay. For the regime, and fortunate events for the radical socialists. Okay, Nicholas II was weak at the time when Russia needed this assertive leader. Okay, and he was not an aggressive, assertive leader. Bread riots started in St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, February 1917, on International Women's Day. For those who read about European history or European life, you know, in Europe, March the 8th, or according to the old calendar in Russia, February 23, is International Women's Day to celebrate women's contribution to economic, social lives. In US, it's not a national holiday, but in many European countries to the present day, it's a national holiday, including Russia. Anyway, women went to demonstrate against the shortage of bread. Okay, and soon bread riots started, and troops refused to shoot at the demonstrators. And Russia was outside of St. Petersburg. He was at the front lines trying to boost the morale of the troops. Okay, as it turned out, it was a very bad idea, because when he was outside of St. Petersburg, his wife, again of German origin, empress, was in charge, and she wanted to show that the regime was in charge, so we are not weak. So she received ministers, she issued orders, and that's what upset a lot of people in the Russian elite and the middle class people, because for patriarchal Russia, it was no good. How come the woman steps in and the Tsar wasn't there? Plus, there was a man who was at that time popular at the court, a peasant man, Grigory Rasputin, a peasant healer, a magician, who was patronized by the Tsar family because he soothes the sorrows of one of their children, Alexis, who had hemophilia. It's basically untreatable disease of blood, and this peasant healer, folk healer, came and was able to kind of soothe his sorrows, and they liked it, that he somehow convinced the son, at least psychologically, placebo effect, maybe something like this. The son wasn't suffering so much. So they sheltered this man at the court, and that's what upset the elite, this aristocratic, educated elite of the Russian society. This dirty peasant with dirty nails was received by the Tsar and his wife. And soon we have, during the war, these cartoons published in Russian newspapers when Russian Tsar and Tsarina were depicted as the puppets of this dirty peasant who suddenly acquired influence in the court. And in reality, he didn't have influence in the court, but everything was amplified, exaggerated. And the reason Russian Tsar had a German blood in his veins and his wife was German worked against them. Soon, these illiterate masses of soldiers, again peasant soldiers, started to exchange rumors that, oh, Russian Tsarina was the traitor and Russian Tsar wasn't exactly Russian. And they betrayed the secrets, Russian secrets, gave them to the German army. And in fact, some rumors said that Tsarina sent supplies and cartridges and shells to the German army, and they were used, these supplies were used against the Russian army. So basically, the Russian Tsar and his wife were treated by the public opinion as traitors. And of course, if you add to this weakness of the Russian Tsar, who was a very indecisive man, didn't know what to do, wanted to stay away from all the political troubles. So you see that the country was indeed ripe for the revolution or anarchy. Okay, and what destroyed Russia was that this backward country started to suffer during the war. Russian army was defeated by German army. Peasant soldiers didn't have enough rifles, didn't have enough food, and soon part of European Russia was occupied by Germans. So Russians wasn't able to successfully resist. They were losing. So France, England did try to provide them guns, ammunition. They actually sent shipments of guns and ammunition, but it wasn't enough. Again, as a backward country, Russia was not able to stay within this war. In fact, in February 1917, Russia was quitting the war. The soldiers refused to fight. They were living in trenches. And the Tsar abdicated. Okay, he was approached by people from the court who said, you have to step down. You have to step down. So we cannot control the situation because troops are not willing to suppress the demonstrations in St. Petersburg. So the Tsar steps down. And that's what triggered this, the beginning of the anarchy, chaos. Entire country was disrupted. Okay, banditry. All economy was destroyed. Okay, law and order did not exist. Soldiers were living trenches. They organized themselves in gangs that tried to rob stores, looting stores, setting mansions on fire, okay, public buildings on fire. In the trench lines, Russian soldiers mingled with German soldiers, okay, hugging each other. In fact, Bolsheviks were encouraging this. They said, hug the German soldiers. And that's when the Bolsheviks steps in. That's when they become very popular. They try to exploit the situation, and which was normal for people who hated this war. Peasants hated this war. And Bolsheviks said, yes, it's a rotten war. And that's, see, that this very moment they came at the right place at the right time. They said, we need to quit this war. Looks very good. Yeah, we don't need this war. The war is a bad thing. Who argues against this? War is a bad thing. And in fact, Rosa, Luxemburg, other radical socialists said the same thing. War is the bad thing. But what they argued next is totally different. Lenin said, you do not need to stop the war. You don't need to stop this war. What you need to do, you need to turn your guns, you peasant soldiers, you German soldiers, you Austrian soldiers, you English soldiers, you French soldiers, you need to turn your guns against your own governments. So his call, Lenin's call, was to turn this imperialist war into the civil war of the poor against the rich. See, that was the message, class war. We shouldn't put aside the guns. We need to kill the bourgeoisie. We need to kill the people of property. We need to phase them out, and we need to take power. See, very powerful call. in St. Petersburg, capital of Russia, which was renamed into Petrograd. Petrograd's a Russian sounding name, where because during the war Russians tried to purge anything German-like. Okay, so the name of the Russian capital, St. Petersburg, sounded too German, so it was renamed into Petrograd. In fact, in the spring of 1917, all trouble started with pogroms against German stores, against German properties, cafes, restaurants, stores, watchmakers' shops. So the gangs of soldiers and some underclass people, these bums, the street bums, okay, gang together and raided German-owned stores or owners who had German-sounding names. So we have this kind of ethnic hatred against Germans. The pogroms, riots, looting in the major Russian city. Okay, attacks on German property. Not many history books tell you about this, but I would like to emphasize this. So what triggered the whole thing, which eventually led to the Communist Revolution, 1917, November, was this revolt, animosity toward the regime that was viewed as anti-patriotic, German-like, and the pogroms against Germans. And indeed, Germans, or Baltic Germans, occupied the prominent positions in the Russian elite. Okay, I always tell my students, and when I teach Russian class, that Germans, and particularly Baltic Germans from Baltic countries, occupied prominent position in Russian society. They were diplomats, they were generals, officers, they were governors. Why? Because historically Russia, as a backward country, was infested with German immigrants who received prominent position in the Russian government and the Russian economy, were to spearhead the development of Russia, which it had started in the 1700s. Okay, that's how historically we have a bunch of German names by 1917. So now it was the revolt against this German element, especially in the cities where people had this Russian chauvinistic consciousness. Okay, so we're Russians, we have to revolt against these damn Germans. The reason I'm emphasizing this, to stress that in many respects it was not a class war. Okay, it was this, I would say, ethnic riots which were presented by contemporary socialists as the class war. Okay. Here you can see the scene of German soldiers and Russian soldiers like dancing together, trying to stop the war. And German government, by the way, was also, German Empire was afraid of this. Okay, they didn't know what to do with this. That's when an important person comes up to the picture, Leon Trotsky, a Russian Jewish revolutionary who occupied middle ground between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Remember, we talked about two groups of Russian socialists, Mensheviks, who said sit tight and wait, and time is ripe for the revolution, and Russia wasn't ready for the revolution, and Bolsheviks who said no, Russia was ready for the revolution. We need to mobilize working class people by the disciplined party. We need to lead them to the revolution. Leon Trotsky tried to bring these groups together. He actually created his own group, so-called middle ground people. Okay, but these middle ground people eventually joined Bolsheviks in 1917. They joined Bolsheviks. Trotsky, an eloquent man. Okay, he didn't have a college education, a self-educated person, a linguist, a good speaker, charismatic speaker. So he puts himself in charge of Petrograd or St. Petersburg Soviet. Soviet, it means council. Soviet of workers, peasants, and soldiers. It's a mob of 1,000 plus something like radicals in the Russian capital. They were meeting together and doing things together. Okay, mob, Soviet, Petrograd Soviet. He also was presiding over creation of so-called Red Guards. It's working class battalions, private army of the Bolsheviks to fight against capitalism. He becomes like a second in command after Lenin. Okay, Lenin was like the brain, and Trotsky was the chief administrator who was in charge of this logistics. Okay, so we have these Red Guards, workers who are ready, armed. In fact, provisional government that took over for a while after Russian Tsar stepped down armed the Red Guards, gave them guns, because Red Guards said, we're going to defend you. Provisional government. But provisional government didn't give land to the people, talked about Western-style democracy, which many people couldn't understand. Okay. And many socialists actually compromised, cooperated with provisional government, because they said, we are not ripe for the socialist revolution yet. What happened in Russia on evolutionary scale, it was a bourgeois revolution, capitalist revolution, which is natural thing, so we have to sit and wait when we have a proletariat, maybe 50 years, maybe 60 years, okay, when Russia becomes completely industrialized, and that's when the country would be ready for the socialist revolution. So they cooperated with the provisional government, saying that, oh, we don't need yet to confiscate factories, we don't need yet to confiscate land to give it to the peasants, we shouldn't yet give factories to workers. And that's how they were losing the face. Mensheviks, there was another political party called SR, the Socialist Revolutionaries. Okay, there were a lot of socialists, but Bolsheviks were able to seize the moment, because they were very anti-war at this moment. And they came up with the popular slogan, peace, land, and bread. What else? Peace, land, and bread. Everybody was agreeing with this, agreeing. They spoke the language of the street, Bolsheviks. Tough language. So they wrote the violence and anarchy. They were tough, and they said, we need to take power. But Lenin lived in Switzerland until 1917. As soon as he heard that the Tsar was toppled down, he immediately begins his plans, preparing his plans to come back to Russia. And that's when interesting things begin to happen. Germany gives Lenin and his 100 plus something socialists, his comrades, a free passage through warlike zones, a free passage to go from Switzerland to Russia. Very strange thing. Okay, that's how these rumors started to pop up that Lenin was a German spy. That's what some anti-socialist newspapers spread around. Okay, but the story is more complicated. So Lenin was not a German spy, but he again seized the moment because Germany was interested in driving Russia out of the war, and they did it. Lenin was interested in getting back to Russia. To what? To do the revolution. And he couldn't get there because it was a warlike zone, war zone. So he did come to the agreement, not personally, through friends. There were some spies who spied for German government among his group, Bolsheviks, or other socialists, and it was normal because Bolsheviks were an underground organization. So through its agents and spies, German government reached out to Lenin, and Lenin was able to compromise with the German military staff to receive funds and permission to go through the German territory. Yes, it did happen. But again, he was not a spy because each side had its own agenda. So we have to remember this. Lenin's idea was to turn World War I into a worldwide revolution against capitalists and bring communists to power. Lenin wanted to encourage Bolsheviks to revolt against provisional government. We need to take over power. Russia is the weakest link, remember? Through this man, Alexander Parvus, okay, a very kind of suspicious guy who, a Russian Jewish social democrat who grew up in Ukraine. So he actually was friends with Rosa Luxemburg. He was at some point friends with Trotsky, with Lenin. So they knew each other closely, very closely. But at some point, Alexander Parvus got in touch with Germans, okay, and his comrades suspected him in being an agent of Germans, so they didn't totally trust him. But at this point, he became like a middleman, which satisfied both sides, okay. He negotiated the passage of Lenin on behalf of the German military through the German land to Russia, okay. Here, by the way, you can see the picture of Lenin before he embarked on his train coming back to Russia through Switzerland. And here you can see one of contemporary cartoons that shows Lenin. Lenin is depicted as the agent of German Kaiser, the emperor. And on the other side, you can see this like heroic painting, a later Soviet depiction of Lenin coming to Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Here, Lenin delivers a speech standing on the top of the armored car. So he got off the train, stands up on the top of the armored car and delivered the speech, calling people to revolt against this weak provisional government. We need to take power. So see this heroic faces ready to revolt. Okay. And indeed, the entire political power was so disrupted, so impotent. So there was no need actually to revolt. Bolsheviks, through Red Guards, they picked up the power. Lenin actually said, we didn't need to seize power. November 1917, Bolsheviks take over power. He said, we picked up the power. And indeed, they did pick up the power. They didn't need to seize the power because everything was so disrupted. Provisional government didn't have actually tools of control, could not control major part of the troops. They couldn't control local governors because entire political structure was disrupted. The structure that was inherited from the Russian Empire. And here you can see the scenes of revolt, 1917 Bolshevik revolt, when many people treated this revolt as the call for more violence, and it was actually unsafe on the streets of St. Petersburg at that time because people, again, gangs of soldiers, sailors, they were looting stores, breaking into bread stores, wine cellars. And these images I'm showing you, it's not something that was depicted late. It's actually scenes painted by a contemporary artist, one Vladimir. It's a very interesting man who was able to survive living in the Soviet Russia, who actually did sketches of St. Petersburg, Petrograd in the fall of 1917, spring, summer and fall of 1917. So here you can see how workers on behalf of the Bolsheviks, they stormed the Winter Palace, that's a Tsar palace in downtown of St. Petersburg, where a provisional government was sitting. And here you can see soldiers poking these paintings, smashing china, so smashing furniture. Here you can see how workers toppled down some monuments, this raging crowd, fanatic crowd, so smashing monuments, symbols of the old regime. On the other image, you can see this crowd raiding the wine store, looters, basically looters who were happy, of course, to take advantage of the situation. And each revolution, as you know, or some kind of revolutionary type event, it's a disorder, it's a mess, it's a destruction of property, human life, innocent human life lost, like collateral damage, right? That's what each street gangster, revolutionary gangster will tell. It's a collateral damage, we are fighting for the greater future. Okay, here you can see this Anyway, but Bolsheviks very soon created one-party dictatorship. So they used the slogan "dictatorship of the proletariat" as the tool to bring their own political party to power. So soon the entire power was grabbed by the Bolsheviks, and they started building up the centralized dictatorship. Although they called it the dictatorship of the proletariat, the people who were in charge was the Bolshevik party. Remember, that was the vanguard that was to navigate the proletariat to the bright future. They talked about workers' control, but in reality there was no workers' control. All the factories were controlled by commissars appointed by the Bolshevik government. Immediately, to put the capital cities, St. Petersburg, Petrograd, and Moscow, under Bolshevik control, Bolsheviks created the secret police. It was essential for the regime. Secret police called Cheka. Okay, Cheka. Why? First, to put down any potential resistance. To put down any potential resistance on the part of the propertied classes. Second, to stop this looting, to stop this disruption of economic life, because they needed, the new regime, communist regime, needed to have a well-functioning economic life. That's what they thought, centralized life. So they started soon to arrest these gangs of looters. At the same time, Bolsheviks started to arrest major manufacturers, aristocrats, bankers, putting them in prison, and some of them were executed. Okay, all power was centered in the hands of Lenin and Bolsheviks. They disbanded any constitutional organs. There were sparks of constitutional organs called Constitutional Assembly, and declared the Red Terror, using the French Revolution as the blueprint. Okay, like French Jacobins, we are going to practice the Red Terror against, first of all, against oppressors. Okay, we're going to confiscate the properties of manufacturers, bankers. Everything should be nationalized, everything. Total socialism, no private property. Private property is evil, remember Marx said. And those people who resist, we're going to smash them, we're going to beat them, and we're going to shoot them. Okay, that was the call. Okay, radical revolutionaries. A person who was put in charge of the secret police was a fanatic, militant longtime friend of Lenin, Paul from Poland, Polish revolutionary, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Hard to spell even for me. Although my own name is also Polish sounding. S-K-I. So Felix Dzerzhinsky. Interesting biographical detail from the life of Felix Dzerzhinsky. In his young adult years, he was dreaming about becoming a Catholic priest. But something happened in his life that totally undermined, that turned upside down his picture of the world. By chance, he shot his sister. By playing with a gun, he shot his sister. And he was so upset about this because he loved his sister so much that there was a psychological breakdown, and somehow he wasn't able. I don't go into details. He went through a spiritual crisis and he lost his Catholic faith. Okay, Polish Catholic. And he discovered the new faith in his life, the fight for the humankind. He wanted to work on behalf of the humankind. So he became a militant revolutionary, fanatic, who spent years and years in a Tsarist prison. He actually got tuberculosis from a long time stay in prison, and then in exile. Okay, and eventually he died in 1926 from tuberculosis. But he was so committed to the cause. I repeat, a true believer. So with iron and blood, he started to execute these propertied classes. And in fact, the major approach he and his secret police commissars issued to all agents of Cheka in local areas was very simple. We are not interested in justice. When you arrest people, when you penalize people, the first thing that should interest you, again, the guidelines of the Cheka, they have to follow. The first thing, when you arrest and when you send people for a trial in the court, the first thing you should take into consideration the class origin of this person. So if this person is a working class people, he is right, because he is working class people. He is the salt of the earth. So no matter what he says, he is right. He is on the right side. Peasant, yes and no. He is deplorable. He is a small kind of property owner. But still, okay. But if this particular person is a bourgeoisie, so he comes from a family of merchant, from a family of clergy, from a family of manufacturer, he or she should never be trusted. In the court, in public space, his or her voice should not be respected, should not be taken into consideration, because they belong to the oppressors, okay? They have privilege. They have bourgeois privilege. So they have no voice. They should be cancelled. They should be smashed. Only people who belong to the salt of the earth, the working class people, they are underprivileged people, they're oppressed people, they should have voice. They should be listened to. So that was the message the secret police sent to all local agents, how secret police should approach people in their daily work, in their arrests, in gathering material against particular people. That was the major consideration. So it should be social justice, or class justice. Social class justice. That should be the guideline for the secret police. Not individual justice, but the social justice. So that's interesting to take into consideration. The guidelines that were issued in 1918. And it was published in the official newspaper of the secret police. At that time, they published even a newspaper which was called Cheka News. Soon, this brutal approach, one-party dictatorship, triggered a civil war in Russia. Whites against reds. Not everybody agreed to accept this regime, and there were assorted people, from socialists to monarchists, who refused to accept this regime. Okay, peasants, of course, were happy. That's what interesting thing. Peasants who did not exactly trust Bolsheviks. Why? Because there were many urban people, city people. So Russian intelligentsia people, Jews, Poles, Latvians, people from Baltic Republic. These were the people who staffed the Cheka secret police. These were activists. Okay, why? Because the people of the old regime refused to work for the Bolsheviks. A lot of them escaped from Bolsheviks to Europe. 2 million people. 2 million people escaped from Russia in fear of this regime. 2 million people, I repeat. So there were hardly any middle-class people to work for the Bolsheviks. So who stepped in? Some educated Russians, Bolsheviks who were underground, Jews who had been oppressed under the Tsarist regime, but the Jews had the highest ratio of educated people. Baltic people, Latvians, Estonians, who had the higher rate of educated people if compared to Ukrainians and Russians. Okay, Poles, some Poles, not all of them. So these were the educated cadre who joined the revolution, who staffed the Bolshevik police, secret police, Bolshevik military officer corps, Bolshevik diplomatic corps. Okay, so this no more Baltic Germans. So it's interesting change. Okay. By the way, with this phasing out of educated middle-class aristocratic people, total phasing out of them from the Russian regime, including the German element, explains why in Germany anti-Semitism grew up so rapidly, because many German immigrants had to escape from Russia, from Russian Revolution to Germany. And a lot of them became foot soldiers for National Socialist Party, created by Hitler and his comrades. Okay, For example, one of the major ideologists of the National Socialist Party was Alfred Rosenberg, a person who graduated from Moscow Polytechnical Institute, who escaped from the Bolshevik regime in 1918. Again, there were thousands of people like him. Just a small remark on the sidelines. So there was also a substantial change of ethnic elements within the Russian ruling regime. Okay. Anyway, civil war started, the brutal civil war between whites and reds. Reds, Bolsheviks. Okay. And the Bolsheviks were a one-party dictatorship. On the side of the whites, we have a bunch of different groups. Mensheviks were also whites, so democratic socialists. They were against Bolsheviks. They were also anarchists who didn't like Bolsheviks, because Bolsheviks shut down newspapers, shut down the freedom of speech. Again, at that time, anarchists defended freedom of speech, by the way. Interesting information for current anarchists who want to shut down the freedom of speech. But anyway, it's a remark on the margins. They were also constitutional Democrats who wanted the constitution for Russia to become the republic. They were also monarchists, so die-hard people who wanted to bring back imperial power. Okay. And they actually were fighting each other, so there was no unity among these whites. Whites, it's a very superficial term. Bolsheviks, the power of the Bolsheviks was that they centralized their power so much that, again, sorry for this, power was centralized. And the power of the Bolsheviks explained by the centralized power. Okay, but it was true. Also, peasants had to choose between these two evils, and by choosing between two evils, many peasants were coming to conclusion that maybe Bolsheviks, who were not landlords, at least they were not landlords among them, they were speaking the street, they were street smart, they spoke street language, a common language, trying to be close to the people. We're going to choose them more. And plus, they said, originally Bolsheviks said land to the people. So that's what swayed peasants in favor of the Bolsheviks. But the whites were supported by Western countries, which was another reason why many peasants viewed so-called whites, from socialists to monarchists, as anti-patriotic. See, there was a nationalist element here. So to peasants, whites were pro-Western. And the Bolsheviks were like, even though many Bolsheviks were not represented by like pure ethnic Russians or Ukrainians, still many peasants viewed them as more patriotic than the whites, because Bolsheviks did not receive help from Western countries. Again, we need to bring to our attention Trotsky, this excellent speaker, charismatic person, who single-handedly built up the Red Army by mobilizing peasants. Like 4 million people, peasants, were mobilized. And he said, we don't need the Red Guards, because Red Guards, or volunteer Red Guards, it's not enough. We need a professional army, and that's what Trotsky was doing. An excellent organizer, revolutionary organizer. As I said, for peasants, the Red were less evil than the whites, and the power of the Bolsheviks, Reds, was the tight discipline, centralization. They were ruthless. Okay, but they were not bourgeois in appearance. Immediately when Bolsheviks came to power, they started building what became known as war communism. War communism. It's economic system, political system that was created during the war, which certainly was affected by these notions I mentioned before, by Marshall notions, Marshall patterns of World War I. Private property was eliminated. Entire economy was mobilized and nationalized. So labor was mobilized. Private trade was forbidden. At some point, money was abolished. Okay. And centralized management was introduced. So Bolsheviks appointed commissars to do what? To control all factories and to ration food. So each class of society was supposed to receive a particular amount of food. Workers, since they were on the top of the pyramid, the salt of the earth, they had the highest food rations. Okay, those who were like peasants didn't receive rations because they lived in the countryside. Middle class people had professionals, teachers, so forth, received the lesser rations. And of course, bourgeoisie hardly got any food because they were the oppressors. Concentration camps were created for the big shots among bourgeoisie, among clergy, middle class people, like prominent names. If you, for instance, if you were a banker, so you had to be relegated to a concentration camp. If you were a parish priest, yes, you had to be locked down in a concentration camp. A lot of historians made a good point by arguing that war communism, it was the product of World War I, and I agree with this. Yes. For example, prominent historian of Russia, Martin Malia, writes, I quote, "It was war that made possible the Bolshevik siege of power, and it was war that would set the parameters within which the basic institutions of the new Soviet order would be built. The party dictatorship of proletariat thus was born in the world of war communism, and this rough beast would be a hybrid of military communism and militant communism, in which each component fed on and at the same time reinforced the other." Unquote. Yes, correct. So much of this regime, the greater part of this regime that was created during these years, 1917, 1921, was informed by the martial methods of World War I, by mobilization, deportation, everything. Okay, but by saying this, I want to draw your attention to something important. Something important. It was not only the war that created this militarized system, okay, the state socialism. It was something else that had been introduced in the socialist culture before. I'm trying to argue here that prior to 1917, in fact, prior to 1914, there was something already within the socialist movement, within the socialist thought collective, that actually promoted martial, centralized mobilization methods. The modernity itself already contained the powerful martial element, mobilization element. And I constantly emphasize from the very beginning when I told about utopian socialists, remember, a council of Newton from up above plants at the top of the pyramid, so-called enlightened masters who control economy, who control social life, who do not allow the grassroots to control the life because grassroots deplorable, they don't know what to do. It was only these technocrats who were on the top of the pyramid who knew the way, who had the knowledge. Again, remember? And Lenin perfectly fit this paradigm because his concept of the vanguard party, these enlightened masters who disseminate the knowledge, Marxist knowledge among working class people, fit this paradigm, the Council of Newton. So it was not only the World War I, it was not only war that promoted these messages. It had been already something that had existed in socialism. This martial element that was there already, and I will show to you. It was there. Of course, by saying this, we need to stress that First World War, came to amplify these notions, martial notions. Okay, that was important. As an example, I will give you a book closer to our home. I will give you an example that is closer to our home. to describe to you that in the intellectual life it was already a widespread notion that socialism means centralization, mobilization of people from up above. And this example is from our American history. Okay, I'm going to flash for you here this book in the middle. Look in the middle. It's a famous book. Many of you might have heard about it. It's a best-selling utopian novel called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. Printed when? 1888. 1888. Again, the book was published in the United States, the most individualistic country in the world, with a powerful tradition of individualism. That is why I picked up this example. So the book captivated minds of American reading public, and it greatly influenced the progressive movement of in the United States, and socialist, including socialist movement, because socialism was part of this progressive movement. Between 1890s and 1914, more than 500,000 copies were published. There were hundreds of clubs of lovers of this book created all over the United States. Okay. It's a fictional account, of course. It glorified technology and industrial centralization as the way to what? To shut down capitalist anarchy, to mobilize entire economy, to bring the great future. Again, the major character, if you remember, of the novel was one named Julian West, a wealthy Bostonian who put himself in the hypnotized himself into sleeping. Anyway, he wakes up in the year 2000. Okay. Excuse me. After waking up, he was pleasantly surprised to see around himself an egalitarian utopia, where private property was eliminated, where a state controlled entire industry and commerce. And in the meantime, all citizenry received from the government equal salaries, or equal stipends. He called them stipends. And again, stipends were equal, no more, no less, so people received the same stipends. Those few people who disagreed with this system, there were some misfits. They were not killed, but they were treated by this benevolent system as mentally ill. So they were sent to psychiatric hospitals. By the way, jumping ahead, I want to stress that that's how in would-be Soviet Union, a lot of dissidents who criticized communism were treated. Okay, in late Soviet communism, 1970s, early 1980s, people who spoke against communism, they were sent to psychiatric hospitals, because who can argue against communism? It was the best system humankind ever known, right? If you speak against the best system in the world, it means you are mentally ill, right? So anyway, in Bellamy, we have this type of society where the people who spoke against the centralized system similarly were sent to psychiatric hospitals. Interesting thing. This society portrayed, the utopian society portrayed by Edward Bellamy, it didn't need elections. Why? Because people already had the science. Okay, and those enlightened masters who were in charge, these were scientists, experts. They were experts, and the person who was in charge of these experts was one, and he was called the General-in-Chief. I would like you to know this expression, the General-in-Chief. And all people were united in this utopia, in the industrial army of laborers, industrial armies. Technocratic experts, including, of course, the General-in-Chief, possessed the superior knowledge. We didn't need elections because they had the ultimate knowledge. I would like you, the reason I put emphasis on industrial armies at General-in-Chief. Please note the martial expressions, martial words Bellamy used. And the war wasn't there. World War I, of course, wasn't there. It was 1888. Prior to World War I, he already had used the martial terminology. It's very important. Okay. In a special postscript to his novel, Bellamy stressed that although the book was the work of fiction, he meant business. He wanted to send society an important message. Bellamy actually explained that the portrait of the perfect society of the future was not some kind of utopia, but his educated forecast based on his analysis of the dominant trend of social evolution. On top of this, before he wrote Looking Backward, Bellamy, by the way, he was the offspring of pious Baptist and Calvinist lineage. He had written a moral essay about socialism called, again, he didn't use the word socialism, I will explain to you why. He had written a moral essay called The Religion of Solidarity. It's 1880, where he portrayed collectivism as a superior notion, superior feeling, in contrast to rotten individualism that he linked to degeneration. Okay. The writer suggested that individuals, they get the true freedom only in society. When they dissolve their self, their identity, their personal identity, they dissolve in society. Basically, he said in this essay, you should squash your individual identity, you should subdue your self and dissolve yourself within a collective, because the tribe collective is everything, individual is nothing. The way to accomplish this collectivist lifestyle and to squash individuals was to subject yourself to the control of a state. It's very important. Another interesting aspect of this message, his message, was that Bellamy generalized about his project of the bright future without using expression socialism. Instead, he used expression new nationalism. Bellamy stressed that he had to use this expression new socialism in order not to alienate those Americans who were not yet educated about the progressive ways of living. So he said, I meant socialism, but I didn't want to scare a lot of Americans because the individualism is such a powerful tradition in the American mind. And by the way, when his readers initiated, said, okay, we are going to create hundreds of communities all over the United States, people who hooked up on his book, like Owen-type communities, there's communes, collective communes, that would be the way to fulfill your utopia. He said, no, don't do it. So you waste your efforts. Why? Because that's not the way to go. Because social evolution goes in the direction of the state, big state, centralized control. So don't waste your efforts. Better create a centralized system. Create the chapters of lovers of my book. Okay. So don't split your efforts. Don't create these communities, because anyway, the way of the future, it would be the way of the state, the way of the centralized planning. See, far before the war, these notions had been introduced, even in such countries in the United States. And of course, these notions are more widespread in Europe and other countries, in Russia included. So in Europe, for instance, another book was popular, and it's here on the slide. It's even more popular than Edward Bellamy. It was a book by Karl Ballard, an economist, a former Lutheran minister who became an economist, and I would say political economist who contributed to building war socialism in Germany during the war. The title of this book is The State of the Future. In German, Der Zukunftsstaat. Der Zukunftsstaat, the state of the future. It became so popular that in Germany it went through 5 editions. The first edition was published in 1989. The second one was published, the last one was published in 1920 in Russia. In Russia, actually, there were 5 editions of this book were published. Five. In Germany, 5. Again, the reason I'm sampling these books for you, not simply like to tell you, oh, there's interesting books and they had these utopias. Each popular book of fiction, you know, reflects the interests or notions, the mindset of the educated strata of society. So each book, it becomes like J.K. Rowling, for instance, Harry Potter, is like immensely popular. Why? Because it reflects certain notions which are popular in our society today. The same thing about these books. Bellamy, widely popular, I repeat, Bellamy, both in the United States and Europe. And now Zukunftsstaat, the state of the future, even more popular. In the case of Karl Ballard, who wrote this book, Zukunftsstaat, it was not simply utopia, it was a blueprint how you should organize your socialist economy. Karl Ballard, who wrote this book, he was himself not a militant socialist. He actually was more on Edward Bernstein's side. He was for evolutionary socialism, gradual socialism. But at the same time, he gave blueprints, and the very nature of these blueprints shows to us that martial, I repeat, mobilization methods had existed prior to World War I. Okay, that's the point I'm trying to make here. Okay, so Karl Ballard wrote this book, and it wasn't simply a scientific utopia. It was a guidebook how you should plan your economy from up above. And the major message of the book, you have to plan everything, production of everything, from shoes to tobacco, meats, and pencils. And in fact, the system he pioneered caught attention of German military staff, and he was made part of the planning board during the war, Karl Ballard. Okay, he became an advisor to war minister, where Ballard actually engineered the system of food ration cards. Okay, General Erich Ludendorff, who presided over the system of war socialism, and politician Walter Rathenau, who was fulfilling this program, created this planning board that was in charge of planning German economy. So from down to each minuscule detail. So all resources, all the food should be mobilized, should be rationed and planned. Okay, labor force, food, raw materials, fuel. And this indeed allowed Germany to stay in the war until 1918. As you know, Germany was never defeated, it simply surrendered. Okay, so Karl Ballard was an advisor to war minister, part of this war socialism. In fact, Ballard received nickname during the war as a Schwein professor because he designed this food rations where he included the pig's fodder. Okay, but anyway, the food ration system he designed allowed Germany to survive through a food blockade. Because if you don't know, Germany was blockaded by France and England. The food shipments were forbidden in 1918, which starved to death 400,000 Germans. Okay, so Karl Ballard designed the system which did allow Germany to at least survive somehow. Well, just a remark on the margins. A famous economist, Ludwig von Mises, once said that, quote, "In the desert of the ration cards, the seeds of communism are thriving," unquote. So that's exactly what we have here. The system designed by Karl Ballard in his book, The State of the Future, captured the attention of Lenin and his Bolsheviks after they came to power because they needed some kind of guidelines. And they used this book as the scientific backup to jumpstart the central planning system. Okay. In fact, the word plan became one of the major fetish words for Bolsheviks. Plan. Proletariat, the proletariat, plan, class struggle. Okay. False consciousness. There are the memes, Marxist memes, they're popular and still popular. So the plan becomes one of these popular memes. Okay. So interesting. Karl Ballard, in the first edition, he made changes in different editions of his book. He was, quote unquote, progressing during the war. In the first edition of this book, he actually argued that each person in society should be entitled to a job. So there should be no unemployment. So if I want a job, I have to get a job and a small salary. Okay. All capable people should be granted job by the state. At the same time, he argued that for any economy of a potential future socialist country to be productive, the government should introduce 5 to 6 years of mandatory labor draft for all boys and girls who completed high school, which later to some extent was fulfilled in Bolshevik Russia. Okay, interesting. In 1919, new edition of his book, Ballard already made a small corrective, but it's very important. He said, it shouldn't be on the right to work. We should have mandatory labor for entire population capable to work. The Economist explained this change in his book by the fact that the right to work became obsolete because as a result of the war, and I want to emphasize it here, as a result of the war, writes Karl Ballard, German national consciousness became so advanced. It was now ready to embrace the mandatory labor work. See, I especially want to emphasize this notion to show how the guy actually who projected this centralized planned notions prior to the war, during the war already amplified the same notions, taking them to the extreme. So it's a very interesting thing. So there were many other people like him. There was another book, which I don't have time to mention, like Bolshevik, actually. Bolshevik Utopia. Alexander Bogdanov, friends with Lenin, who wrote a utopian novel called The Red Star, 1906, where he portrays the Mars, the planet of Mars, where the socialists live, who organized this communist society, where entire life was planned down to a minuscule detail, where the state controls everything, and where people were able to enjoy like 300 years of life because they do this blood transfusion, getting blood from young people and transfusing this blood into old bodies, you know. This utopian book, pure science fiction, of course, you know. It's very much different from what Karl Ballard wrote, because Karl Ballard offered like guidelines, blueprints, okay. But still, Alexander Bogdanov, who was a part of the Bolshevik party, writes this utopian novel, okay. And the major notion of this novel that each successful economy should be heavily centralized and planned down to a minuscule detail, 1906, prior to World War I. So this major argument, I agree with this, that the war, Bolshevik war communism, was very much the product of the war, but it's not a complete answer to our question where these blueprints of communism came from. They had come from what had existed before in the socialist thought collective, and I'm trying to outline right now to you that the notions of this, the big is beautiful, everything comes from the center, and there should be a group of enlightened masters to command and control the deplorables who are not qualified enough. This notion goes far back in the 19th century, okay? Or in our case, 1900, prior to World War I, or in case of Vladimir, the end of the 19th century. But you got the point. That's what I'm trying to argue here. War communism, set up by Bolsheviks in Russia, produced a huge tragedy. Disrupted, in contrast to what Bolsheviks expected. They expected the economy would flourish if you abolish money, if you shut down private enterprise, but the opposite happened. And what happened by 1921, when Bolsheviks had to face a serious crisis in the country, we are going to discuss next time during our discussion. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.